Just wanted to share some information by Chris Hedges about the recent extradition proceedings in relation to Julian Assange. I've left out the questions. It's from Consortium News, which is on YouTube, so do subscribe and check them out. And I just think Chris Hedges' offerings are always interesting and valuable, and so I just put it all together from a particular offering from Consortium News, and I'll leave a link to the whole video from there. So let's support Julian Assange, even if it looks likely that he's going to be extradited. I mean, it's almost zero chance that he won't be, but this is the end of, marks the official end of journalism, and if he is extradited, so it's so important that we pay attention to this. Thanks for watching. Check this out now.
I want to echo, of course, everything that James and Dan said about what this will mean for press freedom. But I also want to highlight how there has been, from the moment Julian was charged, a kind of gross distortion of the rule of law itself in order to carry out what is, in essence, an illegal activity, an assault against the First Amendment, an assault against journalism. You had the United States pressure the president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, to terminate Julian Assange's rights of asylum as a political refugee. Then you had Moreno be pressured again by the United States. He got a large IMF loan after this to authorize British police to enter the Ecuadorian embassy in London. This is diplomatically sanctioned sovereign territory to arrest Julian's an Australian, but he's also a naturalized citizen of Ecuador. You had then Prime Minister Theresa May authorize the police to kidnap and hold Julian, who's never committed a crime. And then you had Trump demand his extradition, although, as was mentioned, he's not a U.S. citizen, and WikiLeaks is not a U.S.-based news organization. And then in the trial itself. So they had the first indictment. This was in March 2018. January 2019, they had a provisional request for extradition that was implemented with Assange's removal from the embassy in April of that year. And then in June of 2019, this was replaced by a second indictment, which was supposed to be the basis of the current proceedings. And so all of the hearings up until now had taken place on the basis of the second indictment. So then what did the United States do? They were worried that they would not be able to extradite him under the Espionage Act, so they wrote a superseding indictment that dated from June 20th, even though the hearings kept going based on the second indictment, and the defense was never properly informed about this superseding indictment. They only learned about its existence through a press release last June. And then they were only officially served, I think, the end of July. That was about 6 weeks ago. And what we've seen, in essence, is that the United States government, through this superseding indictment, has changed the charges leveled against Julian. And the new charges that don't depend on the earlier allegations have nothing to do with the Espionage Act. They are about stealing data from a bank and from the government of Iceland, about passing on information on tracking police vehicles, hacking the computers of a security firm, helping Edward Snowden escape to Hong Kong, although Assange was never charged with this crime, in charging that Assange encouraged people to hack computers, track police vehicles in Iceland, etc. So what they've done is essentially create a whole series of new charges that, without any real evidence, that are in fact criminal, to push through the extradition. And then, of course, he will be charged without doubt if he is extradited under the 17 counts of the Espionage Act and the account of attempting to break into a government computer, which is 175 years. But I think that those kinds of details illustrate how the rule of law itself has been distorted and ignored and trampled on in order to push through this case. So it's not just that we are looking at an assault against the First Amendment rights of a journalist, or I would call Julian a publisher, to publish this material. But we're seeing, I think, a very frightening kind of erosion within the British and American courts of the rule of law itself. Let me talk about what I know, since I made those charges. There's absolute evidence that the United States began to put heavy pressure on Lenin Moreno to push Assange out. Michael Penn, the vice president, made a trip there. The IMF loan was clearly held up, U.S. officials admitted, as a kind of reward for compliance. What actually took place within the highest levels of the Ecuadorian government, I don't know. You might know. But I do know that there was a lot of pressure put on Moreno by the U.S. government to facilitate the seizure of Assange on sovereign Ecuadorian territory in London. Of course, we had preceding that April seizure a series of harassing moves that were carried. Life became exceedingly difficult for Julian inside the embassy. They cut his visitors. They cut access to the internet. What they were really trying to do was kind of push him out on his own volition, and that didn't work. And so they allowed the British police to go in. But that the United States put a lot of pressure on Moreno, and that IMF loan came through once Moreno was willing to hand Julian over is fact. Zero. That doesn't mean we shouldn't fight as hard as we can. And there's always that slim chance that we can win. I sued Barack Obama in 2012 over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which in essence overturned the 1878 Quasi Comitatus Act, which prohibits the government from using the U.S. military as a police force. No one thought we would win. The lawyers, Bruce Afron and Carl Mayer, didn't think we were going to win. Dan joined us as a plaintiff in this case, along with Noam Chomsky and others. And in fact, Catherine B. Forrest in the Southern District Court of New York ruled in our favor and issued a temporary injunction, which was overturned by the Second Circuit. So I think when we carried out that action, it was to bring it to light, to bring the egregious violation of law in the same way that I think all of us are attempting to shine a spotlight on the persecution, unjust persecution and evisceration of law, which has been used against Julian. But I mean, honestly, especially watching Baritzer in this court with her, who is, I sat in on the last hearing in London, and I was going, except for COVID, I would have been there, although now, of course, nobody's getting in the courtroom. They had 40 spots for journalists, and they were all shunted aside to another room where the audio, they couldn't hear the court proceedings through the audio. That wasn't accidental. I have British press credentials through the National Union of Journalists. I should have been given a link. I requested one as a member of the British press, and I was just denied a link. There were only 16 journalists who were allowed to listen yesterday, and it's in and out. So I think the British government is working very hard to hide this kind of Dickensian farce that it's undergoing, because it's an embarrassment. There's no, first of all, there's a conflict of interest with the judge herself, because her husband is part of the defense industry. And so, you'd have to be extremely naive to think that somehow this is a real trial or a real judicial process, as Dan mentioned in his own case. It's a lynching. But that doesn't mean that, we have to fight for all the reasons James pointed out. The consequences of this, and I speak as someone who published classified information on the front pages of the New York Times, the consequences of this are truly, truly terrifying. And I can't stress that enough as a journalist. Did investigative reporting for the New York Times. I have friends who still do it. Government officials are terrified to talk. And this was really Obama. They're terrified to talk because they know that they can be charged under the Espionage Act. Obama did that 9 times, Kiriakou, Snowden, all sorts of others. And so in many ways, it's only those people who hack into systems, people like Chelsea Manning, people like Jeremy Hammond, who hacked into Stratfor, the private security firm, and dumped, I think, 5 million emails, which, by the way, we used in our trial challenging Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, because it showed private security firms and Homeland Security officials actively trying to tie dissident American groups, I'm not talking about like Al Qaeda or anything, but just dissident American groups to Islamic terrorists as a way to use terrorism laws to go after them. So I'll let James deal with the legal aspect of that, but I think it's important to know that there's already been a terrible chilling effect on the ability of investigative journalists to shine a light into the inner workings of power. The the stage set, whether it was outside the embassy, which had all sorts of police officials and a police van with all sorts of monitoring, electronic monitoring, eavesdropping equipment, it is to present him as a terrorist. This is one of in the last hearing when I was in London, the defense asked that he be allowed to sit at the table with them, and the prosecution didn't object, but the judge refused to move him out of the cage, and it's for that reason. It's a matter of presentation. It's not a matter of security. It's as James said, legally suspect at best. But yes, that's right. They attempt to create a kind of ambience, or a kind of with all of the props to essentially when you look at the embassy, or when you look at him in the glass cage, to tar him with that tag of being a terrorist. That's why he's in the cage. James and Jim and Dan are talking about the Spanish private security firm Undercover Global. So yes, they provided the CIA with audio and video recordings, including, of course, as Dan said, with a lawyer, but they also photographed the passports of all the visitors, including mine and Dan. They would take the phones, which were not permitted into the embassy. They opened them. I don't know why, probably in an effort to intercept calls. They would steal data from laptops and electronic tablets and USB sticks, which we were all required to leave in the embassy reception area. They compiled detail of Julian's meetings and conversations with visitors. And of course, the famous move, they tried to steal the diaper of a baby to perform a DNA test to establish whether this was Julian's son. And they worked at the behest of the CIA. So what does that mean? It means that the prosecution has all of the transcripts of the meetings between Julian and his attorneys. John Podesta was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. And those emails were exposed the hypocrisy of Clinton herself, in terms of her telling Wall Street one thing and saying another thing on the campaign. It exposed the donation of millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It exposed the amount of money that Goldman Sachs paid to Clinton, $657,000 for 3 talks, which I think is such a ridiculously large sum, it can only be considered a bribe. And as well as, by the way, the Clinton campaign's efforts to influence the Republican nomination to make sure that Trump was the nominee. And then finally, Clinton's deep involvement as one of the architects of the war in Libya, because she believed it would burnish her credentials as a presidential candidate. So they've earned the enmity of the Democratic Party. And we should not forget that WikiLeaks also made public the hacking tools used by the CIA and the NSA and their interference in foreign elections, including the French election. So WikiLeaks was tolerated when it went after the war crimes by the Bush administration, but it has no friends. And Hillary Clinton herself quipped that Julian should be taken out with a militarized drone. So the aggressiveness of the effort to extradite Julian will be as fierce under a Biden administration as under a Trump administration. You could, I suppose, as journalists have and others have made the argument that Julian should not have released the information in the Podesta emails. But really what you're saying is the public doesn't have a right to know. And at that point, I don't think you can call yourself a journalist. We are not in the service. We're in the service of providing as much transparency and truth about power, no matter who is in power, Democrat, Republican, or anyone else. And so I think, as Dan has pointed out, the fact that so many in the press have turned their back on him, well, not only after using his information, publishing it page after page in publications like The Guardian, The New York Times, and others, but they still refer to it. That is one of the great, I think, shames. The names, first of all, they're informants. So they're not members of the national security state. I think that's an important point. That is a violation. Remember Valerie Plame, when her name was released, largely because her husband was advocating against the invasion of Iraq. That is a crime. But informants is a far more nebulous role. That's number one. Number two, and James may have something to add to this. Number two, as he pointed out, these were released by Luke Harding in his book, by releasing the password to the documents. That was done by the Guardian correspondent, not by Julian. Quote Kevin Aziz, I mean, so much of activism is education, which we're all doing today. The last time I was in London, and if I don't know whether they are having demonstrations outside the court, but the last time I was in London for the hearing, there were events almost every night, which I participated in. So I think making our voices heard, especially when they're largely shut out by the mainstream media, which unfortunately has betrayed Julian, and that is about education. It's about being on the streets. It's about carrying out acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. And that has more influence and pressure, I think, than often activists understand. I was involved with Zuccotti at Occupy Wall Street. Kevin and Margaret were with Occupy down in Washington. Unfortunately, large numbers of my family work on Wall Street, my cousins. But what was fascinating was how terrified they were of the Occupy movement. They were all bringing their lunches and eating it at their desks. And they had their private security firms, I know because they told me, updating them every hour. Well, now they're marching down Bond Street with a puppet like a giant squid. And so we have more impact than I think oftentimes we understand. And that's extremely important that we raise our voices, but also we are physically present to oppose what's being done to Julian now in London, and I fear potentially in the United States. In his words, we're galloping into this transnational corporate dystopia, that the internet is not just a tool to educate, but has become a mechanism for postmodern surveillance. And this is supranational. It's dominated by a global corporate power. And as they write in the book, they will merge global humanity into one giant grid of mass surveillance and mass control. That at its core is what Julian and WikiLeaks and other Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden are really fighting against. The wholesale surveillance of all of our communications, which are permanently recorded, permanently tracked. All of our interactions are followed from birth to death. And that is a terrifying, it's something even Orwell couldn't imagine. That's really what we're fighting here. And the decay of democratic institutions, the seizure of power, both nationally and globally by these corporate cabals that have fused themselves, as Silicon Valley has, with the national security state, presages a really terrifying new dark age. And that's why I have such deep admiration for Julian, who, as Dan said, is not just someone I respect and defend, but is a friend. And all of those who have had the courage to come out, and let's not forget Kevin, who understand what's coming and have put themselves on the line, as we have to put ourselves on the line to protect and reestablish an open society.